Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another episode in the museum's Facebook Live series. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. Today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. 76 years ago, Soviet troops liberated the Auschwitz camp complex, including its killing center. And people around the world pause today on this somber anniversary to honor the memory of Europe's Jews, whom the Nazis and their collaborators attempted to annihilate. It's a day to remember the warnings of the Holocaust era and to defend the historical record, now more than ever, as we have fewer and fewer eyewitnesses to these events. Please join me in welcoming today's guest, Susan Eisenhower. Good morning, Susan.
Good morning, Edna. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for the opportunity and also the honor of presenting today for the International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
It's an honor to have you. For those of you who are not familiar with Susan, she is an accomplished scholar whose most recent book is titled How Ike Led: The Principles Behind Eisenhower's Biggest Decisions. You may be familiar, or you are likely familiar, with Susan's grandfather, Dwight D. Eisenhower, either as the United States President between the years 1953 to 61, or during World War II as the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. Today, we want to focus on a lesser-known but incredibly important aspect of Eisenhower's legacy, his determination to document the crimes that we now refer to as the Holocaust, even as the Allies continued their fight against Nazi Germany. Eisenhower recognized then that one day some might deny the truth about the atrocities committed against European Jews and other victim groups. During the course of today's show, please post your questions for Susan in the comment section, and we will get to as many of them live as possible. So let's begin by understanding a little bit of the forces that shaped your grandfather's background, Susan. Where was he born and raised? What was family life like for him growing up?
Well, Ike was actually born in Denison, Texas, but grew up in Abilene, Kansas. And there he was part of a German-American community that had emigrated to the United States in 1741. This family were deep believers in pacifism. They abhorred alcohol, cigarettes, and dancing. They were actually a very religious family. You can see Ike there over on the extreme left. He's the blonde of the family. And these are six boys altogether. There were 7 sons originally. One died in infancy. So Ike was a real student of history as a young boy and often had to be reminded that he should put down his history books. As a matter of fact, his mother locked them up in a closet. But actually, of all those boys, Ida Stover Eisenhower said that her son, Dwight, had the most to learn. He was a passionate character. He felt injustice. He was alert to injustice. He had a temper that his parents had to teach him how to control. And altogether, I guess he was a bit of a handful. But certainly going to West Point changed much of that. And you just saw a wonderful picture of him in high school.
And you mentioned they were a very religious family, pacifist. His mother, Ida, was in fact a Mennonite, right?
She was. This is a subgroup of the Mennonite church. They were called River Brethren. And it was a large community that left from Pennsylvania and went to Abilene, Kansas in the late 1800s. So
it must have been quite the statement for Ike, and you've told me I can call him Ike. I don't want to be disrespectful.
Yes,
for Ike to come from this background and then to go to a military academy. Tell us a little about that trajectory and how he rose through the ranks of the U.S. Armed Forces.
Well, the Eisenhower family were farming people, and my great-grandfather, David Jacob Eisenhower, did not want to be a farmer and tried his hand at business, which wasn't terribly successful. So he had a modest job at the Abilene Creamery. They couldn't afford to put their kids through college. And Ike put his older brother through college, but then went to West Point because of the free education. And I think it also merged with his interest in history and military history.
And I want to take a moment to acknowledge visitors viewers. I'm used to speaking in museum terms where we have visitors, but unfortunately our doors are closed now due to the pandemic. And we are very pleased to welcome viewers from around the world. Good morning, and thank you for joining us, or afternoon, wherever you are, in Hampshire in the United Kingdom. Hello in Toronto, Canada. Peru, London, also in the UK. We're glad to have viewers from Sao Paulo, Brazil, from Tokyo, Japan, Guadalajara in Mexico, and here in the United States from Belvedere, Tennessee, St. Augustine, Florida, Jackson County, Michigan, Goldsboro, North Carolina, and just up the road in Wilmington, Delaware. So greetings and thank you for joining us. So when General Eisenhower, and he became General Eisenhower, became the Supreme Allied Commander during the war in Europe, what were his responsibilities in this role and his approach to them?
Well, actually, Dwight Eisenhower was the strategic leader. He was the Supreme Commander, and his job was to reconcile all the factors involved in any military operation. And of course, when he is given that appointment, he has been given the appointment for Operation Overlord, which is what we often call D-Day. His job was to rationalize the strategic objectives with logistics, with the use of forces, with the politics, with everything that goes into making a successful operation. This is actually one of my favorite pictures of Ike during the war. He's actually here talking to the 101st Airborne Division. Literally within an hour, they are going to take off for the coast of Normandy in what is one of the most ambitious and certainly the largest amphibious landing in military history. This is one of the largest operations ever. And so, there were a lot of factors there, including a very dicey weather forecast. And as you know, paratroopers have to have the capacity to see their targets. So this was a very important moment for Ike to be going out and looking in the eyes of his soldiers and to make a connection with them. I think his feeling is that he wanted to know and see the people who would have an impact, who his decisions would impact. And I think it's a very moving picture because you get some sense of his humanity there.
Yeah, it's such a powerful image, and we know not unique that he made it a point to personally greet thousands upon thousands of soldiers, whatever their rank, that he took their risks and sacrifices very, very seriously.
Well, that's right. And he felt that morale had to be an input to any successful operation rather than just the result of victory. So he thought it was important that they knew that the Supreme Commander cared about them and understood the challenges in front of them.
Kind of lump in the throat type interactions to imagine. But I'd like us to turn to a transformational moment from the following year, during the last weeks of the war in April 1945. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp, and it was the first such site liberated by U.S. forces. Reports quickly got back to General Eisenhower, and he insisted on seeing for himself what was uncovered there. What did Eisenhower find at Ohrdruf?
Well, first of all, driving into the Ohrdruf area, apparently the atmosphere was absolutely overwhelming. The smell of decaying flesh was overwhelming. And already Dwight Eisenhower, General Omar Bradley, and General George Patton could tell that they were about to enter some kind of a really dire situation. It was so bad, as a matter of fact, General Patton, deferred going into certain parts of the camp because he was felt he was getting sick. Now, Ike, learning extreme self-discipline finally as a kid, really felt it was important to look in every, as he said, every nook and cranny of the camp because he wanted to bear witness to what had occurred there. However, I mean, if you look at these pictures, which are really rather remarkable, you can see a very defiant stance in Eisenhower's physical composure there. And you can see a kind of set jaw. As a matter of fact, after this incident, he went back to Patton's headquarters and told his valet that he had never been so angry in his life, that the English language didn't even have words that could describe what he saw. He was astonished at the hideous ways the Germans had for treating and disposing of these bodies, and all of it was in a violation of every rule of war that had ever been written. And so Eisenhower determined, you can see he's got his hands on his hips there. I mean, I'll tell you, in family body language, hands on the hips means something really serious, as does that very firm jaw that you can see. in any case, I think it was, of course, it was critically important that he went through, quote unquote, every nook and cranny, because he wrote to Winston Churchill and he said, everything you read in the paper about this does not adequately describe what has really happened here.
And indeed, he demonstrated the impact of that, the pain of what he had seen in his actions over the subsequent weeks, when he was surely very, very busy winning the war. The war was not over. But after witnessing Ohrdruf, he demonstrated an extraordinary foresight and recognizing that one day some might deny these crimes, that they might prove to be too extreme to be believable. What actions did he take?
Well, and I have to say that was what impressed me most about researching all this, because that evening, after he got back from Ohrdruf, he sent a message to Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall, and said that he wanted, first of all, he said that the camp beggared description. He had all kinds of adjectives, including bestiality, but he, as he later said, those words were inadequate. He wanted General Marshall to send members of Congress, reporters, and Ike also ordered anybody close to those camps, or all officers who are not at the front, to go to these camps to chronicle it. And as a matter of fact, many of those pictures, including our own family collection, represent photos that were taken there by my father.
And when we were prepping for this show, you described to me, I thought it was a really powerful turn of phrase, that Eisenhower had an extraordinary talent for thinking in time, this capacity to project really, really far ahead. Could you comment on that a little?
Well, I think, again, what I found remarkable about this was Eisenhower's capacity to, in real time, to look at what he was seeing and then allowing his mind to work beyond the current shock. And he was in shock. As a matter of fact, his valet said that when he came back, his face was like his valet had never seen his face before. But yet, while he's looking at this truly disturbing scene, he was thinking about 50 years from now. And he just knew that the horrors were so beyond imagination that if this didn't get chronicled, people would say it never happened, or it would be put down to what we call today fake news or propaganda or whatever. And so I think, and he made a very, very big point in the last weeks of the war to make sure that these things were chronicled, and the Army was sent in to take documentary footage so that later they could be shown to the German population as we got into the accountability phase of this terrible war.
And before we turn more specifically to the German population, I would like to quote more extensively from the cable that you mentioned that General Eisenhower sent to General George C. Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Part of it is in fact quoted in our museum here in Washington at the outset of our permanent exhibition, and it reads, quote, "I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to quote unquote propaganda." And for viewers who are watching, please look at the links in the comment section. You'll see that you can participate in a crowdsourcing project we have called History Unfolded, in which you can learn how American newspapers at the time reported on Eisenhower's push, on his invitation to U.S. congressmen and to journalists to come and bear witness for themselves. But as Susan, you just mentioned, he also felt it was important to compel ordinary Germans to view the camps and to see the crimes that were committed in their names. Let's show a clip from the time that illustrates that endeavor.
Nazi party leaders and office holders were commanded by Allied military authorities to visit concentration camps in the neighborhood of their cities. They were forced to see with their own eyes crimes whose existence they had indignantly denied. At Weimar, all citizens were ordered to visit the concentration camp. They started the trip as though they were going on a picnic. After all, it was only a short walk from any German city to the nearest concentration camp. But there was no picnic behind the barbed wire. Death was the only one who had feasted here. Each and every one had been murdered on orders of the Nazi High Command.
Susan, that's not easy footage to watch. It certainly couldn't have been an easy experience at the time. Why did your grandfather find it so important that average civilians be brought in to witness these atrocities?
Well, there were many people at the end of the war who said they didn't know. And Ike had very little patience for that. He felt that if they didn't know, they were closing their eyes to it. Or those who said they were only following orders did not cut mustard with General Eisenhower. He believed that that there was a responsibility in the orders that you accepted. I must say that the other rather interesting thing is he put out orders that townspeople should come in and give the Holocaust victims a dignified burial. And that must have been every bit as searing to the German population as actually having to go in and witness the camps. Later, a documentary film was put together and it was circulated around Germany, and the German population was compelled to watch it.
We do have in our collection still photos and I believe also film footage that shows some of those burials happening. I can't help but think, looking at that clip that we just saw about the young children who were brought there. They are the only ones who would still be alive from that scene today, but clearly that's something that would have been seared into their memories. We have a viewer question, Susan. A woman named Sandy is asking, what do you think your grandfather would say to all of the deniers of the Holocaust now?
Well, he would have, I think he'd have very little patience for it. And I think he would, depending on how widespread it was, I think he would, of course, he bore witness to it, so he would be able to validate its reality. It's a little hard to take him out of his era, because I dare say we wouldn't have gotten into a situation that we're in today, where we have a post-truth environment where people feel like just what they want to think is legitimate and fair game. But anyway, it's a good thing that he did put together encourage the collection of these important documents. It's so widespread, there's so much of it, that it's impossible to deny that this happened.
And Susan, it wasn't just an impact on your grandfather, but on many generations of your family. I know from speaking with you that you were quite young when you learned about the Holocaust. Your father, John, had graduated from West Point only months before enlisting, and he was among the troops that were called to witness the camps. What did your father tell you about his experience, in his case, at the Buchenwald concentration camp?
Well, of course, he not only described what he saw, but he had taken a significant number of photographs. He was an amateur photographer anyway, but they were encouraging young officers, anybody who was in these camps, to actually take pictures so that it would add to the volume of evidence we have. My father thought that this was such an important chapter of World War II that we were raised on those photographs. I can't tell you how many times I've been through that photograph album that is largely focused on what he saw at Buchenwald. And my father made sure that my own children and even my grandchildren saw these pictures before he died. Again, he must have had some kind of a feeling that even though we couldn't bear witness directly, we had to tie his knowledge to him and his credibility. And it was an important thing for all of our family.
And that somehow that responsibility to bear witness is transitive, that it is carried on. It's a burden carried from generation to generation.
Well, it must be. Otherwise, there's room for the deniers and the liars to make inroads into what public understanding is. This is one reason I think with the Holocaust National Memorial and Museum, this is such an important benchmark for our country and for the other museums that are similar to it around the world.
I'd like to encourage our viewers to post your questions for Susan in the comments section. But change course a little bit here, because we're very lucky that not only are you a scholar of history of the Soviet Union, of your grandfather, but you are also a granddaughter. And I'm hoping that you could give us some personal insights. Tell us a little bit about off-duty Ike, what he was like as a grandfather and a family man.
Well, his high school yearbook, he graduated from West Point in 1915. He was described as big as life and twice as natural. And I have to say that really just beautifully summarized his personality. What a big figure. I mean, in every conceivable way. I mean, and what a smile. So I must say that in writing How Ike Led, I knew about these decisions, of course, but then for the first time in my life, I put it together with what I knew about him as a person. And I think the thing that's just extraordinary is how he managed some of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century and kept his calm. We would have, I discovered that occasions when we were getting together with my grandparents overlapped with major crises in the civil rights movement, including sending the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, Arkansas. So all of those things come together to make me realize actually that self-discipline was really something he exercised well, but he was always optimistic. And given the dark things he saw during World War II, I'm surprised in retrospect that he could keep his optimistic center at all times. And then finally, let me just say that he had a wonderful, wonderful, kind side. Look at that face of a grandfather, right? That's taken
That's on his lap, right?
I'm sorry?
That's you on his lap, right?
Oh, that's right. That's me. This is taken at Camp David in 1954. I was 17 years old when he died, so we had tremendous opportunity to be with my grandparents during those years. And I can tell you that he loved kids. And he always used to give us advice whether we wanted it or not. But one of the big pieces of advice he would say to us always, you have to be for something. You can't be against things all the time. You have to be for something. And that's always stayed with me. I think it is at the, it's fundamentally about optimism.
You have shared with me that, in fact, he also was a painter in his spare time. Could you talk a little about that? Because I was surprised to hear that.
Well, this was something that was very much part of my childhood. It was Ike at the easel. There's a picture that he's doing right there, as you can see, of my mother and three of the four of us before my younger sister was born. He painted after the war. He started, but throughout his presidency and post-presidency, and he did it as a way of centering himself. If you have these enormous responsibilities and a complex set of circumstances, he believed it was very important to go let your mind work, settle down, and let the various levels of your brain produce some new insights into the problems at hand.
It's what we would today, I guess, call mindfulness.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
I'm struck listening to you now and in prior conversation talking about him. He's been described as a warrior who hated war. He seemed to have a prescience about him, a kind of foresight, but also a self-awareness that one needs balance in life in order to navigate such heavy weights.
The balance thing is very important. And so you can even see it in the way he handles big issues like U.S.-German relations, this kind of balance of accountability and eventual reconciliation. I mean, this is all part of balance.
Could you talk a little bit more about that, about how what he witnessed, what he saw, what his experiences are, how he then translated that into recognizing the dangers of ostracizing Germany after the war?
I'm afraid some of this is my speculation, but I'm thinking of a young boy who grew up in a German-American household where a lot of German food was consumed. His uncles all spoke, uncles and aunts spoke German. They spoke English too, but they spoke German. And then to go watch the events unfold and be in a position of power to change the trajectory of history. I was thinking sometimes, as I wrote this book, about the painting and what he was processing in his own mind about good and evil, about his ethnic roots, about what turns a civilized people into maniacs. I don't know that there's another word for it, into people who are so fanatical that they will do things that are completely inhuman. And I think, he was very aware of the conditions that brought Germany to that point, and the dangers of really dangerous leadership. And so I think this is one reason why he felt, it was important to find a path of reconciliation with the Germans after they had taken full account of what they did during the war.
And I remember that even just within days of accepting the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, he said to his staff, and I quote, "We will know we have won this war if 50 years from now Germany is a prosperous democracy." What did he mean by that, do you think?
Well, I think he meant that, the end of a war is really the beginning of a new chapter. And it's as hard, when he decided to run for president, he thought that it was his duty to try and win the peace. And I think this was exemplified by the fact that in 1955, exactly 10 years to the very day of the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, Dwight Eisenhower brought West Germany into the NATO alliance. In what one German described to me as our iron embrace.
Very powerful, and not necessarily the path that everyone would have followed after those experiences. And I do want to acknowledge a viewer named Valerie who had written in to ask about the effects on Eisenhower from viewing, memorializing these atrocities. I think you've described a lot of those to us. We have another question from a viewer named David, and this might be more of a historian question for me. David is asking, didn't the U.S. military have definitive proof of the details of the death camps prior to actually liberating one? Why was it such a shock to the military? A very complex question, David. It depends who you're talking about. In the case of, yes, the United States government did at the highest levels have irrefutable evidence of the scale of Nazi crimes and some of the details of the mechanics of it. But the average United States soldier was not sent to Europe with the goal of liberating Jews. That was never the military priority. And I remember in particular a man named Irving Haymont. He was a colonel in the Army at the time. He described himself not as a camp liberator, but as an overrunner, because he felt that the term liberator implied intent, that he and his fellow brothers in arms overran these sites in the course of achieving a different military mission, which was the defeat of Germany. And that if you think about someone who's 18 or 19 years old, a young soldier who might have seen small news reports, but not with the kind of photographs that we're used to now, not with the sort of vivid and brutal newsreel footage that we just saw, how could you not be shocked as a human being to witness firsthand, to see people who look like skeletons, to smell the smells, to see the scale of it? So I think it's very different to talk about knowledge and understanding, and also at those different levels of responsibility and access to information.
Right, and without the defeat of Nazi Germany, this would all be an academic question. I mean, the end of Nazism made it possible also to assure that these camps were shut down for good. But you're right, it's a complex question. Eisenhower does say that he had gotten secondary reports of these things. But, I think it's fair to say, who could even imagine, really? Who could imagine, even if he warned Churchill that even if I tried to describe it, the English language doesn't have words for it. So I'll just leave my part of that question there.
This reminds me actually of words from one of the Holocaust survivors who volunteers at our museum, a woman named Agi Geva. She was asked at the time of a dedication of a new memorial to General and President Eisenhower here in Washington to reflect on what he meant to her. And she said, "I shall never forget the moment when we saw the American troops and heard a voice telling us, 'You are free.' It was indescribable, unbelievable. It was a miracle. My 4 great-grandchildren would not be here today if not for General Eisenhower and the American soldiers who fought so courageously." So I think it just helps us to remember the human impact, and magnified by thousands and thousands and thousands of people, including those of the soldiers who lost their lives in fighting for that victory. Susan, in the time we have left, I want to turn a little bit more to the analytical side of your most recent book, which is about Eisenhower's approach as a leader. What inspired you to write this book, and what were some unique aspects of his vision of leadership that you think might speak to us now in this present moment?
Well, first of all, it might interest you to know that I got the idea to write this book at one of the Holocaust commemorations. Yeah. I was invited to attend one of the dinners that marked this important date. And when I heard somebody stand up and talk about this visit to Ohrdruf, suddenly in my mind it clicked. I wonder why he went to so much trouble to get this chronicled. It wasn't in his job description. Nowhere in his job description does it say to do anything other than to destroy Nazi power. And so then I thought, well, he didn't have to do it, so why did he? And I started getting curious about that particular element. And the more I looked into his career, the more I saw that he was often telling hard truths to people he was closest associated with. Now, I'm not saying he was closely associated with Germany at any point except ethnically, but, you know, he was a truth teller. And he also had an uncanny capacity to assess whether or not something he was doing could be sustained over a longer period of time. Now, in sheer leadership, he believed that accountability, truth-telling, and building positive relationships, you know, were fundamental to his leadership. And I think we see it time and time again in his record. So it's very moving to be on this program specifically because it was the Holocaust Museum and all you do there that really gave me the inspiration to look into how brave it was even to admit that the stock from which he came could have been so compromised and, you know, in terms of its own moral standing. And again, there are no words in the English language for anything we're discussing here.
Well, thank you for that, Susan. I know I speak for my colleagues when I say that we're very grateful and humble. If at all, we could offer you some inspiration or food for thought in how to approach your own history, your own work in a new way. We're in an extraordinarily fractured moment in our nation's history, and what is particularly troubling is that many Americans don't even share a common understanding of what is credible or what is true. Susan, a viewer named Lisa is asking, what can we do personally to address the so-called post-truth we find ourselves in currently? And what do you think that General Eisenhower's ideas can offer us today?
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as post-truth. We've only called it that because we've given up trying to reason with our neighbors who think something completely differently than we do about the facts. Ike was very facts-oriented. You can't fight a war without needing to know the facts. And so I'm sure if he were alive today, he would be talking about the importance of finding facts that we can all agree upon. But frankly, at the end of the day, it's a failure of leadership. The facts could be told about a whole range of things if certain people who held political positions right now were willing to help educate their followers who believe that something that happened, who believed a set of untruths. This is a dangerous time for this country because we don't want some of these situations to fester. That was the thing about World War II. It'd be hard to imagine a Germany today if they hadn't been held accountable. And so I think we have to hold our public figures accountable. Those who lie and tell people things that aren't true need to be held accountable in the marketplace of ideas. And we have to be better neighbors to those who we disagree with. And I think that civility, if it starts with us, might make its way up the political and intellectual chain.
Well, General and certainly also President Eisenhower embodied a lot of those values. I can see that he has passed them on to you. I'd like to end on a more personal note, Susan. We have a comment from a viewer named Kathy. Kathy writes that my dad was a member of Ike's Boys, a group of his bodyguards who deeply respected him and would have done anything for him. After the war was over, this group of men would meet about every 5 years in a different town in America. Any thoughts for Kathy?
Well, Kathy, this rings absolutely true. And I am so lucky in life to be invited often to those reunions. And I know about Ike's Boys, and I think it's wonderful that you raised this here today. You know, my grandfather loved those boys. And I think I'm glad to know that it was passed down to you, that the feeling was mutual.
I also want to give a special acknowledgement and thanks to the families of many, many liberating soldiers who are sharing their personal stories in our Facebook comments today. Susan will be glad to share those with you after the program. We are very, very grateful for their bravery, for their sacrifice, and also especially for those who did not live to have descendants. We owe them a great, great debt. Susan, it was a real pleasure to talk with you today about your book, about your grandfather as a man and as a leader. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
General Eisenhower, as we've described, presciently, with foresight, recognized that there could be future challenges to the truth of the crimes that we now call the Holocaust. He anticipated a day like today when, unfortunately, we continually confront Holocaust denial and distortion. And Eisenhower's exceptional legacy endures in so many ways, not least in the many lives that he helped to save. At our museum, we are proud to honor Eisenhower's extraordinary contributions. And you are right now seeing a photograph of the Eisenhower Plaza, one of the entrances outside of our museum here in Washington, D.C. When you are next in Washington, when travel is safe and possible again, also you can visit the National Memorial to President Dwight D. Eisenhower, which opened just this past September. At the opening of the show, I mentioned that today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and our museum will be having a virtual ceremony in commemoration at 1 p.m. Eastern Time here in the United States. We hope you will come back to watch it or look for it again later on YouTube as well. As for Facebook Live, please do join us for our next Facebook Live program, not on our usual Wednesday, but instead on Friday, February 12th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, when we will be sharing, perhaps unexpectedly, love stories from the era of the Holocaust. Love helped to sustain many people during dangerous and terrifying times, and for others, it put them in great danger. So please join us on February 12th for some of these powerful stories. Until then, be safe and well wherever you are, and take good care. Bye-bye.